Welcome to the Revive Ministries Podcast. This month, we're actually wrapping up the theme "Breaking Free to Healing." There's a quote that I've heard from Lady Aberdeen. She says the difference between the difficult and the impossible is that the impossible takes a little more time, a little longer. I have a new guest today, and her name is Fiona. Thank you so much for joining us, sharing your insight and your story. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
I want to share with those in the United States. I always do a disclaimer. Now we have 988 number for the suicide crisis lifeline. This happened this month. So if you are in crisis in the United States, I do encourage you to seek that out. But wherever you are around the world, do find the resources that may be available and may be appropriate for you. Thank you again. Um, Fiona, for joining. I'm going to start off with a quote. I know I started before, but I know people say it better than me. But I want to introduce this quote by talking a little bit about the person who gave the quote. Her name is Helen Keller. Helen Keller was the first deaf-blind person to earn a bachelor's degree. She was the leading member of the American Foundation for the Blind. She was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964. Impressive. So many limitations when to communicate, but she still communicates today. Helen Keller quote says, "Although the world is full of suffering, it is full of also overcoming of it." What comes to mind, Fiona, when you hear this quote?
Um, yeah, absolutely. About the potential that we can all see the world differently, no matter how we see it. It's always an opportunity for something new, and to be grateful for the things that we have, rather than worrying about the things that we don't.
Yeah, and it's inspiring when you hear stories like Helen Keller and stuff like where there is limitations that's obvious that people can see, but they go beyond what is expected. And I find that for me, especially when we talk about breaking free, and that the idea of healing, I feel it's very, at least for me, inspiring. But with that being said, Fiona, you're new to this podcast. I always love having new guests and also them sharing a little bit about themselves. Fiona, I'm gonna turn it over to you. Could you share with those listening a little about yourself and what brought you here? Well, brought you where you are today. Being a little bit vague, so you could kind of share a little bit more about yourself. Fiona.
Lovely. Okay, so I am currently living in Melbourne, Australia,
Hmm.
in my mid 40s, and have lived my life a little different from most people's experience, as I have been legally blind. So, deteriorating eyesight since I was young.
Hmm.
Always been in the legally blind category. It's just sort of gotten worse over the years. It's been quite an interesting journey in the fact that it has been a fairly slow deterioration. So I've always had the opportunity to adapt along the way.
Hmm.
But having said that, um, I think the biggest challenge has been sometimes not only worrying about what I can do for myself, but the expectations of other people, and fitting my story in with what other people around me are expecting from me, and that are willing to let me experience life. And so sometimes that's been about study or jobs, or various parts of life, just sort of having that acceptance from the community about what it is that I can do with a disability, versus what the perception is as to what they're thinking that I can do. So it's been really interesting. So these days I work a full-time job for our Victorian government. I run my own business doing resilience coaching and inspirational speaking,
Hmm.
and like to live a very busy, challenging life full of lots of adventure and opportunity along the way. So always something happening.
Well, that's wonderful, and I just want to ask you, Fiona, if you don't mind me, what has helped you, with those you work with, or even yourself, moving past? You briefly mentioned, the trials that you've been through, but what has helped you through those maybe negative perceptions when you think about your disability, or and what did not help? Like what helped and what did not help, and what do you see help others It does not help. I know that sounds convoluted, but I'm trying to prompt the question that
Yeah.
makes sense. So,
I think for what for myself helps the
mm,
most
mm,
is, I guess I was in some ways really lucky, and in some ways I guess, unlucky, but it turned out to be sort of, my own journey.
mm,
Was that where I grew up was in quite a rural location, and before the days of the internet where the world became a much smaller place,
mm,
we were quite isolated. And so, having said that, the closest capital city was about 5.5 hours away, which
mm,
meant that, it was quite resource poor in terms of medical assistance, and even, just those support structures that were set up through the education system. So it was a case of kind of, be resilient and move on with life the best you can with what is, put in front of you. And along with that, even though I had an older sister who had the same disability, there was a sister in the middle that sort of didn't have. And so we're all quite spread out in age. So I was kind of doing it by myself pretty
mm,
much, and was the only person that I knew in my age bracket that had a disability, and really just kind of just gone with life, and became, I didn't have any special things set up for me really, or
mm,
the things that were set up for me didn't really make me that different to everybody else. And, from my perspective, especially in my younger years, I just sort of, get up to the same mischief as every other child sort of
mm,
was doing. And of course, there were people that were looking out for me, so I didn't sort of, hurt myself or fall into the lake or do whatever might have been
mm,
happening. But as a general rule, I didn't really feel that much different until I sort of hit those teenage years, and that was when that sort of identity crisis kind of stepped in.
mm,
And that's the time where I think, the support structures that I really needed, suddenly the gaps really showed themselves.
mm,
And, and what didn't help was people who weren't supportive and had very low expectations. And so quite a close member of my family was sort of saying to me, well, I don't understand why you're so worried about your senior school studies, and worried about what's going to happen next, because you're not really going to amount to anything in life. And I'm not quite sure what they call them in the US, but here they used to be called sort of sheltered workshops, where people with
mm,
disabilities might have been lucky enough to get a job, but it
mm,
was doing something that was considered to be quite a menial task.
mm,
And I'm like, well, no, that's not me. I want to go to university. I want to study social work. I want to help other people.
mm,
And, there was just not that support structure there. And so I think for someone who has any contact with someone with a disability, I think the
mm,
most important thing is to treat that person as an individual. We've all got a different story to tell, no matter whether we have a disability or not. Every person is individual, and to take that person in the moment at what they're presenting to you, and treat them with the respect that you would to give to anybody,
mm,
rather than sort of, putting your own perceptions on what you think that person, trying to put them in a box,
yeah,
instead of instead of saying you belong in this box. And everyone, even people with the same disability, I mean, even say people with the same diagnosis as what I have, view life very differently and have a
yeah,
different experience of disability in the way that they operate, versus even saying, well, everyone that's blind, or everyone with a disability,
mm,
or everybody
mm,
else that you can kind of
yeah,
categorize.
yeah. When the grouping never does help, I really don't feel, because everyone is different. Everyone's journey
Mm,
is different, and I do. When you're sharing, you're talking about when we're younger. I remember hearing this one person speak, and this says, you get a 5-year-old and say, who's the best singer, everyone will raise their hand. It's like there's this innocence, like no one,
yeah.
everyone's like, who's the best dancer? It's like, yeah, I'm the best dancer. But something happens when you get older. And that teenage years can be extremely rough, and especially when you have disability and you have people maybe in your life that are close that don't understand or like the
Mm,
group, because it's, sometimes, recovery is messy. Sometimes when people, but our lives are, uniquely complex. One thing I did like hearing from you is a lot of times value is just used, but value is not a lot of times valued. And I feel part of what you're saying is sharing, and I appreciate is that you valued yourself even at that age. You had some support. Some people obviously told you, well, you're not going to amount to anything, but you didn't. Uh, Even though it bothered and not trying to minimize it, it didn't stop you. It
Mm,
didn't stop
mm,
you from moving forward. And it's when you value yourself, when you put time, you put boundaries that are healthy, you're able to say, you know what, today wasn't great, but I'm going to try again tomorrow. And I feel
mm,
it's an inspiration when you, and a lot of this happens not in our comfort zone. Adam Braun
mm.
says that true self discovery begins when your comfort zone ends. A lot of times we just want that comfort zone. It could be toxic, something that we are used to, familiar, but sometimes it doesn't really help us in the healing. What
No.
when you hear this quote, what comes to mind?
Yeah, I think just, being in that area of discomfort, I think that gives us the opportunity to learn. If you're
Hmm.
not in that area of discomfort, it means that you're not learning anything. And I mean, you don't want to be there all of the time
Yeah.
because that becomes exhausting in itself. But I think to be able to know the times where you say, you know what, like I need to give this a go, take
Mm-hmm.
the opportunity that is presented to me and see how it turns out instead of just sticking to the same old things, because if you stick to the same old things you're going to get the same old results and you're not ever going to move forward. So stepping outside of that comfort zone and saying, well, you know what, I don't have to be the adrenaline junkie and do all the
Mm-hmm.
crazy adventure things. I can only take just that, maybe even that baby step outside of my comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
That is sometimes just enough to get you moving forward.
Yeah, and I feel when you're around the right people, or people who are positive, you're building on your supportive resources. Accountability doesn't become a bad word. A lot of
Mm,
accountability becomes something that you seek after, not something you hide from.
mm,
So I feel that in turn has been, at least my personal, what I've seen with the people I work with in the mental health field, be one of those pivotal moments when people can see past that. That it will be this uncomfortable, and like you said, every day cannot be a crisis situation. Every day cannot be us grinding and self-discovery. It is painful. It's overwhelming. There is the ebb and flow of things. But I do, when we're talking about this, I feel it's important to recognize that a lot of what we learn are through our discomforts, because
mm.
it forces us outside of what we normally are accustomed to. Um,
And you know what? You look back on those times and you think, oh gosh, the most traumatic things that have happened in life.
mhm.
And you think, how can that be a good thing? But if you really reflect upon it, you've actually come out of that experience somehow different. And if you can really refocus and say, well, actually, I did learn something from that. It might have been that I had a new opportunity, I built a new relationship, I become stronger in myself. There's always something that comes out of those traumatic experiences, and to actually be able to acknowledge that is really important as well, I think.
I also wanted to mention just being present. The one thing that is getting lost is, like, if you could be in a room with 100 people, if you could talk to an individual and make them feel like they're only one there, like being
Mm,
present at the moment, it's lost. Like, we're so distracted. There's so many modes of communicating, but we don't do it well a lot of times, and I'm guilty of it. I have my smartphone, I'm on it. I have my text. I've tried to wean off a certain understanding that if I'm with my wife, if I'm with my friends, I need to be present. I can't just be just because I'm in the vicinity. I know this is the kind of world, because we're so connected. I could talk to someone like I'm talking to you. You're all the way in Australia, right?
mm,
I could talk to anywhere around the world. It's just so, because I turned 40 this year, so I know, like, before, when we didn't have that, when there was just no internet, where just I had a beeper when I was in high school, that kind of thing. But now it's just, we're so connected around the world, but we just kind of assume, just because we're in the same room, we're being present. We're not. We're either on our phones. We're not connected. We're not communicating. And another thing you mentioned was just how we view. There's this word. My wife has this book. It's untranslatable words in other languages, and Haraith. Someone told me how to spell this. Say this correctly. Haraith is Welsh. It says a hope sickness for somewhere you cannot return. The nostalgia and grief for the lost places of your past, places that never were. I feel if we're really being honest, if we look back at our past, sometimes it's, we go to the classroom when we're in elementary, it looks so much smaller. Everything's kind of a little bit off. Not to say like we intentionally try to skew what our past, but we have this, and unfortunately, if we're in our comfort zone, what I find is sometimes those pasts look a little bit different. We're like, oh, those things get kind of glorified. Maybe they're toxic relationships or habits or something like that, and they get reintroduced and re-emphasized in our lives, and that can be a barrier to us moving forward sometimes, or at least what I experienced. So I want to ask you, Fiona, turning it back to you, what has been, and we've been talking about that, but what has been some notable elements that changed the way you perceive things today on your journey? You talk about your journey. What has been some milestones that you would like to share with those listening today?
I think sometimes it's about having the people that are your support networks and knowing those people have really got your back. And sometimes they don't even realize that they're doing it. I know especially, and it's only something that's really come to mind in the last, year or so, is that, there was one teacher, especially when I was at school, and look, there was probably a point in high school where I really should have been diagnosed as clinically depressed. But of course, back in those days, no one ever really sort of, did that. It was kind of like, just move on and pull your socks up and get on with life.
Yeah.
And now I look back and I go, oh, look, but that one teacher actually took the moment to ask me what was happening. And, it was that moment of enlightenment where I realized not only, hey, okay, yeah, well, things are pretty rubbish for me, but also gave me the opportunity to say, well, hang on, if things are rubbish for me, there's probably other people that are experiencing this as well. And that was the moment where I realized that I wanted to actually take that, that experience of my own and move it into something that was going to be my career. And I've taken that career move of, helping other people along their journeys as well. So that was really interesting. But I think quite often we're the support person for somebody else without even realizing it. I know there's a friend that every time sort of, something miserable happens in my life, can always pick up the phone call and she's, I don't know, 600 kilometers away or something. So, lives in another state, but I can always pick up the phone and just have a chat. And it doesn't have to be the deep and meaningful, me telling her what's going on, but just have the conversation and, to listen to what's going on in her life. And by the time you hang up, you're feeling so much better. And, I think to have that person in your life or to have that support structure that okay, well, there's people that I can reach out to, or it doesn't always have to be people, but even just the things that that you can do that will bring you from that level where you're not feeling so great back up to a level where you're feeling better. So whether it's listening to your favorite music or doing some exercise or patting the dog or, whatever it happens to be, that one thing that will just bring that mood back up again when you need it.
Yeah, and connections do matter. Whether you're an introvert or extrovert, you still need to connect with people. The one thing when you were sharing, I was thinking of a question on my end. Something came to mind. I was in the military in 2000, 2004. I remember, I was really struggling, and I remember a person that I didn't even think of. He invited me to go Brazil. There's a Brazilian jiu-jitsu. This is the first time I started, and honestly, I look back and I'm like, he really helped me because at least I got focused on doing something. I loved it at the time. It pulled me out of some toxic kind of things I was doing, and made me focus on my on something different, something better.
Mm.
It was uncomfortable, but it was something I didn't even think of. But it could be that small. I don't even know who the person is. I don't even know. He's the one who introduced me to it. But though that's the point. These people may be in your life for a minute or a second.
Mm.
They may still be in your life, but it's all kind of, it all matters. And you mentioned support. There's a lot of support groups and people. I've seen real success in support groups because you're allowed to share. You're allowed to be heard around people that most times are you know um, more tactful, and you feel safe enough. And I feel a lot of benefits to that. And lastly, you mentioned about things you used to love to do. Well, one of the things I noticed when I really am struggling, I stopped doing the things I really love to do. Like I like
Mm.
to sing. I pretend to play the guitar. It's not very good, but it's one of those things. So music is one of those things I like to do. So understanding that and going back to that can be very helpful, at least from me remembering some notable elements. When I start being excited to be creative, whatever that
Mm.
may be.
Mm.
Think about John Lennon at 5 years old. The teachers ask him, "What do you want to be to get when you get older?" "I want to be happy," and she thinks he got that question all messed up. But I don't know. Being 40 years old now, I feel he's more right than wrong. When I want to get up, what I want to be when I grow up, I want to be happy. We all
Mm.
do in some way or form. I find what you're doing, helping others, is very much what I love to do. I love connecting with people. I love just being present, and it's been a journey for me, switching just kind of really focusing on that. It's about the other, strength based approach. It's about the person, not about myself, and being excited for them to make those little successes in life. So I do appreciate what you do,
Mm.
Fiona.
Thank you. And it's so amazing sharing in that journey and that realization. Sometimes it's just the little things, sometimes it's the huge things that, you see people make changes with. And it is so rewarding to say, "Oh, I'm so glad that that person has made that step in their own life and they're finding that happy." Because,
Yeah,
we so often aren't happy for whatever reason. And when
yeah.
someone can say, "I'm truly happy,"
Hmm.
that's amazing.
That is.
Mm.
Fiona, as we wrap up, any final thoughts you'd like to share any with those listening today?
I think, and you just touched upon it briefly, but finding what those unique gifts are, those things that make you, that lose yourself in the moment, yeah, those things that are your happy place, your flow. I think we all need to remember what those are and tap into them a little bit more, and make that part of your identity. I think quite often we get so caught up in the everyday stuff, and it's one of those things that if you get to the end of your life and you look back and you reflect on the way that you would like to be remembered,
Mm,
I don't think for myself I would like to be remembered for all of the things that are what we do on an everyday basis. It would be
mm,
more the things that you're doing that are making that difference in the world, and that difference to your own life, and the difference that you make to other people. And so I think, to incorporate some more of that in, and to a bit more self kindness. I think we all are very, very hard upon ourselves,
mm.
and we're, more than happy to put ourselves down, and to give those harsh words to ourselves where we probably would never think about giving that harshness to somebody else. And
Mm.
so to be kind, to look after yourself and find those unique gifts and really, really celebrate what those are, and then share them with the world. And I think, that makes you happy, and then in turn that will make everybody else happy as well.
Well, I want to say thank you, Fiona, so much for joining us. I want to share with those who are listening. Remember, stay updated with all things Revive Ministries through the various platforms, reviveministriesfl.com. If there's anything you want to share, Fiona, just let me know. We'll put it in the notes for those listening and watching. This is goodbye from Revive Ministry Podcast, leaving with this last quote from Neil Strauss. It said, "Great things never came from comfort zones."